When Carrie-Anne Moss asked Keanu for a couple movie recs for her kids, he didn't send a text. He built a whole list. It starts with a Nick Cage kidnapping comedy, hits a James Caan dystopia where corporations replace war with blood sport, and ends with a farting western that Warner Brothers literally tried to bury. These are the movies Keanu Reeves personally thinks you should watch, and not a single one of them is boring. Early Coen brothers. Nicolas Cage and Holly Hunter kidnapping one of the quintuplets of a rich businessman. The Coens wanted it to be the exact opposite of their debut, Blood Simple. So they made it more positive, filled with characters you actually want to root for. And at the time, audiences didn't really know what to do with it. It was a comedy, but one of those comedies where everyone plays it completely straight, kind of ahead of its time that way. And what's crazy is, nowadays, this kind of humor shows up everywhere. But back then, it was a risk. The movie ended up pulling in $29 million off a $6 million budget, so it definitely found its audience. And it stuck with people. Matthew McConaughey once said it's the movie he's watched the most in his life. When Keanu was asked what his favorite action movie was, he didn't say Die Hard, or The Matrix, or anything remotely expected. He said Rollerball. The original one, from 1975. Rollerball imagines a future run by corporations where war has been replaced with a televised game that keeps the population entertained and distracted. James Caan plays Jonathan, the superstar athlete who refuses to retire just because the system tells him to. The stunt work in Rollerball was so realistic, the cast and crew actually started playing the game between takes. No one died, despite what some rumors say, but there were some serious injuries, and a few stunt guys ended up in the hospital. Keanu summed the movie up perfectly. Violence, a game, and philosophy. Social commentary. Fantastic. This isn't just one of Clint Eastwood's best westerns. It's one of his best films, period. And Keanu putting this on his list makes total sense. It's a revisionist western with a lot more going on under the surface. Eastwood plays Josey, a Missouri farmer turned guerrilla fighter after Union soldiers massacre his family. The story tracks his journey through the wreckage of the Civil War and how vengeance and survival twist into something else entirely. And apparently, it still hits home. Clint said people don't stop him in the street to talk about Unforgiven. They stop him to talk about Josie Wales. He said he rewatched it recently and it still holds up. Said he's proud of it, and he should be. It's a masterpiece that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Mel Gibson speaks just 16 lines of dialogue in this entire movie, and somehow that's more than enough. The Road Warrior isn't just a sequel that works, it's the kind that outdoes the original in every way. Grittier, leaner, more explosive. Right up there with Aliens and Terminator 2. George Miller took that dusty, post-apocalyptic world he built in the first Mad Max and cranked it up to 11. The budget this time was just $2 million, 10 times more than the first film, but still pocket change by today's standards. And yet, Miller made every cent count. The action, the stunt work, the world building, it's all tight. Keanu Reeves loves this one. So does James Cameron. He once said it was one of the big influences behind the Terminator. And in Judgment Day, John Connor's dog is named Max. That's not a coincidence. The Bad Batch is a weird, slow-burn dystopian thriller that mixes Mad Max with Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And yeah, that's exactly as insane as it sounds. Keanu stars in this one, alongside Jason Momoa. The story follows a young woman who gets dumped in a desert, barely survives a run-in with a group of cannibals, and ends up in a strange cult-like settlement. The movie flopped at the box office, but it was selected to compete for the Golden Lion at Venice and actually walked away with the special jury prize. And Keanu clearly had a blast making it. He called it a rock and roll movie, romantic, tense, full of odd characters, and beautifully shot. Luc Besson's The Professional might be one of the most controversial cult classics of the 90s. It's about a hitman who ends up taking in a 12-year-old girl named Matilda after her family's murdered. She becomes his student, and things get complicated. It was Natalie Portman's film debut. She was just 11 when she landed the role, beating out over 2,000 other actresses. The part of Léon was written specifically for Jean Reno. Besson didn't want anyone else. But that didn't stop major actors from circling it. Both Mel Gibson and Keanu Reeves were reportedly very interested in playing the role. It's the kind of film that sparked debate, but it's also the kind of film people remember. And clearly, it left an impression on Keanu. This is where the roots of The Professional really start. Another Luc Besson film, this one tells the story of a convicted criminal who's pulled out of prison, given a new identity, and trained to become a government assassin. It's sleek, stylish, and hugely influential. And technically, it's tied to The Professional. The two share characters, kind of. Jean Reno shows up here as a cleaner named Victor. He wears the same coat, the same glasses, carries the same suitcase. His job is killing people and cleaning up the mess. A few years later in The Professional, Jean Reno's playing Léon. But Besson said it himself. Maybe this is just Victor's American cousin. More human this time, but still carrying out the same work. This is the oldest film on Keanu's list. And no surprise there. Seven Samurai isn't just a classic. It's one of those movies that shaped everything that came after it. Directed by Akira Kurosawa and released in 1954, it pretty much laid the blueprint for the modern action movie. It directly inspired The Magnificent Seven with Steve McQueen, and it's been a touchstone for directors like George Lucas, Francis Ford Coppola, and Quentin Tarantino. Keanu's a huge admirer of Japanese cinema and philosophy, and he's talked about how John Wick was shaped by that influence. Anime, samurai films, samurai code, all of it. Keanu's also a fan of Amadeus, Miloš Forman's biopic about Mozart, told through the jealous eyes of Antonio Salieri. It swept the Oscars, winning Best Picture and 7 other Academy Awards. By the time it finished its awards run, it had racked up 53 nominations and 40 wins, and it's been a favorite among actors and directors ever since. Christopher Nolan actually had Cillian Murphy watch it when preparing for Oppenheimer. He called it a wonderful story of rivalry, and said the dynamic between Salieri and Mozart was a huge influence on how they approached the relationship between Strauss and Oppenheimer. This one is a bit more left field, a Shakespeare-inspired comedy with Tim Roth, Gary Oldman, and Richard Dreyfuss. Keanu's a fan, even if critics couldn't agree what to do with it. Roger Ebert famously gave it 0 stars, but the film's held on to a cult following anyway. Dreyfuss wasn't even supposed to be in it. That role originally belonged to Sean Connery, who bailed for a bigger paycheck in the hunt for Red October. The film takes 2 side characters from Hamlet and builds a whole absurdist story around them. 2 men stuck in a script they didn't write, trying to make sense of a world that doesn't explain itself. Keanu also threw his love behind The Evil Dead, Sam Raimi's blood-soaked horror film from 1981. Raimi was just 20 when he made it, and the whole production was chaos in the best way. They had a rented camera, no permits, actors getting injured, people getting lost in the woods. It was pure guerrilla filmmaking. The movie was made on a shoestring budget, just $375,000, scraped together from donations and favors. Raimi didn't care about censors or ratings boards. He just wanted to make something terrifying, and he absolutely did. The UK banned it outright under the Video Recordings Act. It got slapped with an X rating in the US, and it wasn't even available uncut in Britain until 2000. Now this is one of the big ones on Keanu's list. It doesn't need much of an introduction. It's Jeff Bridges as the dude, John Goodman as his unhinged bowling buddy, and a whole story kicked off by a case of mistaken identity and a ruined rug. Keanu's a fan, and John Goodman himself called it his favorite film he's ever acted in. The guy said he never had more fun on a set than he did on this one. Funny enough, the Coen brothers themselves have never quite understood why this movie blew up the way it did. In one rare interview from 2009, Joel Coen said flat out that this one seems to fascinate other people way more than it does them. This is Gene Wilder at the absolute top of his game. Young Frankenstein was a huge box office hit back in '74, but the comedy holds up like it came out yesterday. Wilder plays Dr. Frederick Frankenstein, a modern medical lecturer who inherits his grandfather's creepy old castle and gets way too into the family business. It's Mel Brooks at his sharpest, a parody of classic horror that's somehow both totally ridiculous and incredibly smart. It ended up with $86 million at the box office, and they only spent $3 million to make this thing. Blazing Saddles is a stone-cold classic. Gene Wilder again, this time teamed up with Cleavon Little in a western that completely tore down Hollywood's usual rules for comedy. The big thing everyone remembers? It was the first American movie to include audible fart sounds, and as dumb as that sounds, it almost got the movie buried. Mel Brooks talked about how badly that first screening went with the Warner Bros. Execs. One of the guys in the room apparently turned to the others and said, "I suggest we eat the picture. Let's bury this. It's disgusting. I don't want Warner's name on this." In the end, they gave the film a small release in just a few cities, with no marketing, and it exploded. By the time it left theaters, Blazing Saddles had made over $100 million. It got 3 Oscar nominations and became one of the biggest comedies of all time. So much for burying it. Now this one's a bit more under the radar, but Keanu's not just recommending it, he's in it. It's a dark, twisted indie horror. Elle Fanning plays Jessie, a teenage model who arrives in Los Angeles and quickly rises through the fashion world. But as her success grows, so does the jealousy, and things start to spiral into something way darker. It's weird, unsettling, and visually stunning. Not everyone loved it, but if you're into moody, artsy horror with a sharp edge, Keanu's pick makes total sense.